Hey, Jenna.
Hey, Dom.
So what's going on?
Well, it looks like it's still open season on the press by the White House, so there's that.
Oh, it just never ends. Yeah. Well, you know what, Jenna? We're going to continue our conversation with Rick Perlstein from last week.
Woo-woo.
Fascinating discussion that we're going on with him. But also, we're going to talk about this big Media Matters study on how the right wing is dominating online shows.
Well, that's definitely a topic of discussion, so let's not waste any time and start the show. Hi, I'm Jenna.
And I'm Dom. You know what's funny? Not long ago, we were both breaking news. Now we're
Breaking unemployment records.
exactly just like thousands of other journalists who've been laid off from newsrooms across the country.
Yeah, and after the shock wore off, we kept asking ourselves, what the hell do we do now?
And over many, many cups of coffee,
And maybe a few drinks.
we realized we had a unique opportunity here. Why not pull back the curtain on what's really happening in American media?
Right? I mean, we've spent years in this industry seeing how stories get made or don't, and now we can actually talk about it.
And trust me, there's a lot to talk about. From local news disappearing to social media reshaping journalism, we'll break it all down.
And look, we're not here to lecture anybody. We just want to help make sense of the information that we're getting and maybe have some much needed fun along the way.
So whether you're glued to the news, just trying to figure out what's real in your feed, or curious about the future of media, come hang with us.
Welcome to Laid Off and Looking, a podcast where two journalists.
Are taking a critical look at American media.
All right, so here's what I mean about all out war on the press. So, as you and I both know, having worked for a public media outlet, I've worked for them my whole career. Funding from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, or the CPB, has been a big source of revenue for these organizations. I mean, don't get me wrong, there's still, donor funding and grant funding and all this other stuff, but that's a big source of money. And very recently, the Trump administration drafted a memo to Congress outlining its intent to end nearly all federal funding for public media, such as NPR and PBS, where we worked. And this is from an article that I got from, ironically, NPR, which good on them for reporting what seems like the attempted assassination of their news organization. This is crazy stuff. So, yeah, apparently the White House issued this memo that basically said that the current administration, the Trump administration, is planning to ask Congress when it comes back at the end of the month, because as of right now, they're still on their holiday break, to basically resend the money that had already been appropriated to go, I believe, as far as 2026, if not 2027. And specifically, even though NPR and PBS weren't directly mentioned in the memo, it was pretty clear what they meant, because apparently what the memo said was that, and this is a quote, for years, American taxpayers have been on the hook for subs. Oh no, sorry, they did mention. Okay, that's my bad. I didn't read the whole thing, but this is why reading is fundamental. Okay. So the memo says, for years, American taxpayers have been on the hook for subsidizing National Public Radio and the Public Broadcasting Service, which spread radical woke propaganda disguised as news. And then went on to say that trash that passes as news and intolerance of non-leftist viewpoints. I just want to go on the record and say, as someone who has spent most of their career with organizations who are member stations of both of these outlets, that is demonstrably false. That's just not true at all.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's just like I think we've learned with this administration, disagreeing with them means you get classified as fake news or you're not owning up to the facts. So it's or the fact that you just don't promote what they want you to promote. To me, news should be based about facts, and you should be able to disagree with another organization, and you can, and not, but facts are facts. I mean, yes, I agree. Having worked there for close to 10 years at PBS, it, it really is one of those things that I know what I put out there was not demonstrably false. And also I know that, we had on different voices. We had on conservative voices on our new show that we worked together on. And
Exactly.
And actually, many of them appreciated the fact that we would have them on. We'd have really, we'd have real discussions, even if people were, and we did that
And we'd have
from both sides,
challenging discussions. That's the other thing, is that we didn't
for
shy
both
away.
sides,
Yeah.
for both sides, of the aisle, not just one. So
This is
I
what I'm
agree.
saying. And to categorize the work that we did and so many other amazing journalists and public media do as trash is beyond offensive, because we're talking about journalists that, first of all, if you work in public media, you're not getting paid, you're getting paid a lower salary, because it's a nonprofit, than you would be at, some other for-profit newspaper or commercial news station. So let's just start there. These people are doing, in my
Mhm,
opinion, the Lord's work for less money. So
mhm.
there's that. And I just, everything about that statement is just so unbelievably incendiary. And I get it. It's meant to enrage people or to get a rise out of the
Exactly.
left. But that's not at all what's going on here. There's nothing, just because you can control and manipulate what's being said does not make it wrong. And again, I go back to, just because you're also hearing from marginalized voices that are usually left out of the national discussion does not make it propaganda.
And
Everyone
when
in
you
America has a right to be part of the conversation.
when you specifically look at even a show like PBS NewsHour, I mean,
Yeah.
the work that they do in terms of covering all the bases and hearing all the voices. I mean, so much. I've always heard people from even people who might not. I mean, I've heard from different side people who have different opinions, and they've always given credit for things like PBS NewsHour because they do feel like they are getting actual news. Um, it isn't there just to placate to one audience, and I think that's what some people in that administration or the entire administration want. They just want somebody who basically just says, yes, everything you're saying is right.
Then what
And
you want is propaganda, not news.
it's not news. So you can't go after them for that. So, yeah, it's just infuriating. But like you said before, I think that's exactly what they want. Um,
Exactly.
well, going on to another story again, continuing that theme of,
All out war.
open all out war with the media. Our next headline comes from the online magazine, The Hill. And basically, it's about how Trump's going after 60 Minutes again. So, what happened here is the administration, he went on, he basically is saying that CBS should lose its broadcast license after they had a recent show that had two segments he didn't like. One of them was a segment on the Ukraine, one on Greenland, and he said because he's angry because it cast him in a negative light. He went on Truth Social, his social media uh, platform, saying that the coverage was derogatory and defamatory. He wants the FCC to hit them with major fines, and this comes on top of the fact that, of course, the $20 billion lawsuit that Trump filed against CBS last year over a Kamala Harris interview. So CBS says the lawsuit's baseless and no comment yet from the FCC. You know, like I really like so it comes back to this sense of there's no way you can disagree. The instant that you disagree, you become an enemy. And I don't understand how you could have a free press if
I don't think
you
that's the intent or the goal at all. And there's something
no.
incredibly chilling about, just like, I don't like what you're doing, so just pull the plug on the whole thing. And again,
And
not did they say anything factually incorrect? Did they like mislead? Well, I guess it depends on how you view that Kamala Harris interview that they edited. But the point is, that's not what 60 Minutes is. And you don't like it, and you don't like, perhaps the tone of a story or something like that, does not give you the right to just pull the plug on the whole thing.
but we also know this is a game that gets played to intimidate,
That's also very
and
true.
part of this we know Paramount's in the process of working out a deal with Skydance and you have this whole deal trying to go through of emerge and having how does that basically if you kind of can hold that over them that if you're trying to get something out of them or if you're trying to intimidate a news organization, from being really careful of what you say about, who's in office right now,
I
about
don't
the
even
Trump
think this is
administration.
careful anymore. This is be afraid, be very afraid
Yeah,
to basically piss me off.
yeah. And if you do, guess what's going to happen? I can make your life miserable. And that's scary again, because you could do that in many different ways. We've, for weeks we covered what was happening with the AP, and that's still an ongoing story. We see what what happened with ABC not long ago. Now, it's 60 Minutes, it's PBS, it's going after all these news outlets. And interestingly enough, like, you don't hear anything from the conservative side of some of the media outlets. You know, Nothing's being said about them. So, as long as you agree. I mean, mind you, when they step out of line too, we've seen Trump go after some of them if they've stepped out of line. But still, this is where I just, just going back to even our, the conversation we were having with Rick Perlstein last week, this is where it gets really interesting when you have people in power. The kind of power they can have over the media is chilling, because it can, you're talking about censorship. You're talking about, ways of controlling the media and withholding the truth.
Yeah, no, it's incredibly authoritarian. But as you mentioned, we're actually going to be continuing our conversation with Rick Perlstein, where he breaks down Reagan's significant, yeah, going back to the 80s, Ronald Reagan's significant influence on the media during his presidency, and how, Reagan might have been the great communicator, but he manipulated media narratives and, of course, repealed the Fairness Doctrine and allowed for the consolidation of media. We've actually had some guests talk about how problematic that was and brought us figures like Rush Limbaugh. Well,
Right?
speaking of the 80s, because we had another president who was had a huge impact or influential on the press. I'm not sure which one is the correct language, but of course, I'm talking about Ronald Reagan.
Right. Well, I mean, where to begin? Ronald Reagan was called the great communicator for a good reason. I mean, I could show you, texts of speeches that he has edited in his own hand that are absolutely brilliant. He knew how to just absolutely boil things down to their essence.
Well,
He was a
Hollywood.
broadcaster
Yeah.
because of Hollywood. He was a broadcaster. He started his career in radio as a sports guy, right? Um, Famously, he would hear he would get the play-by-play from Telegraph, and then he would kind of pretend the game was going on in his head, right? So he was a storyteller, right? He understood that people thought in stories, and he was a master at shaping narrative, right? And he after he was governor of California between 1967 and 1973, he had a daily 5-minute radio show in which he'd tell these little stories about how stupid the government was and how beautiful America was and yada yada yada. So he was a creature of the media, but he wasn't just a guy who, when it came to this part of his presidency, was taking direction. I mean, he really was kind of shaping, and a lot of the stuff was, he would pop out one of his contact lenses because it helped him make eye contact with the people in his audience. I mean, you can almost never find a picture of Ronald Reagan since he was a kid in which he doesn't have this kind of awareness of the camera, right? So he's kind of the perfect vessel, for storytelling, right? And he was very good, and the people around him were very good at shaping media narratives, right? There's quite a good book about this that came out in the 80s called On Bended Knee, the press and Ronald Reagan. And it's called On Bended Knee because he really was very good at getting the media to tell the story the way he wanted it told. A lot of it was this kind of ref working and this kind of manipulation of the media's own, inward guilt that somehow they, weren't listening to the guy in the diner in Des Moines, Iowa. So interestingly enough, this is a guy who mostly got a free pass from the press. No one was talking about impeaching him, during Iran-Contra, which was in a lot of ways was, more unconstitutional than Watergate was. And but there's still, conservatives, unless you're 100% on the team, you're 100% the enemy. And so, the narrative still was preserved and extended on the right within the Republican Party that the media had this anti-Reagan liberal bias, right?
Well, I am wondering also about Reagan and the Fairness Doctrine. We
Oh,
had
right. We're gonna talk about that.
Yeah, because we had a conversation with I believe Jeff Cohen, who was
Mm,
a guest earlier on the show and was talking up from Fair and had been talking really just passionately about how the consolidation of
right.
American media really just took off in the
Took off
80s.
after the Fairness Doctrine
There
went
we
away.
go.
That's a
So,
that's a pretty interesting story. It kind of gets told as a simple morality tale. Like the media was kind of balanced while we had a Fairness Doctrine until 1987, and then that went away, and suddenly Rush Limbaugh took off. It's this is a classic thing that historians say. It's more complicated than that, but basically the Fairness Doctrine was something that didn't have a lot of teeth. Uh, Only one broadcaster ever was sanctioned for it. This right-wing broadcaster who decided he was going to do pirate radio offshore, and it was like 1973 or something like that. And when broadcast corporations themselves began kind of agitating to get rid of the Fairness Doctrine just because it was a pain in their butts, really. You kind of had to make some kind of gesture towards fairness. And what it meant was there just wasn't a lot of opinion editorializing at all in the media because it was just too much of a headache. So there was a media lobbyist named Mark Fowler who got involved in the Reagan campaign.
well, I know
And
that name.
so Mark Fowler became the head of the Federal Communications Commission under Reagan.
That's why.
And he, started agitating to get rid of the Fairness Doctrine on behalf of his, buddies in the media industry. Interestingly enough, I don't know if Jeff talks about this, the actual right-wing activists, like the Phyllis Schlafly's of the world, they wanted to keep the Fairness Doctrine. They thought that was the only thing between them and complete liberal media domination. So it's a really ironic story, as often it happens in history. But, long story short, basically they got rid of the Fairness Doctrine because the industry wanted it. And it was right around the time when this guy who was one of many local right-wing radio talkers, Rush Limbaugh, every city had him, kind of what was the guy in New York, Grant, every city had some kind of right-wing media guy. Um, when media consolidation in radio stations was starting to happen. And also you had a new kind of satellite-based technology, which made it a lot easier to do free long-distance telephone calls, so you could have live call-ins. So it was really the only first time you could really do technology kind of coast to coast that way. So all these kind of factors joined together. The shedding of any requirement of ideological balance, which was probably the least important part of it because it wasn't really enforced anyway, and the technology and these media conglomerates that had 100 200 stations, the ones we think of now, like Cumulus and Clear Channel and Sinclair Media, and also the idea that they figured out that if you have like a right-wing show and then you have a left-wing show, people just will kind of turn off the radio. If they're left-wingers, they'll turn off when the conservative goes on. The conservatives on, they'll turn it off when the liberal goes on. So they just decided really that it just made more sense to have the same kind of consistent programming all throughout the day. So there's kind of like these Rush Limbaugh imitators spring up. You have the fact that Limbaugh was, this brilliant entertainer, this brilliant broadcaster. And lo and behold, by the time George H.W. Bush is president in 1989, Rush Limbaugh has 20 million listeners a day in, hundreds and hundreds of stations. And they're putting him on the cover of the National Review, calling him the leader of the opposition after Bill Clinton wins the presidency. And so, by you know, basically the 90s, certainly the 2000s, and even more so now, a person, thanks to also Fox News, can stew themselves in this right-wing media miasma. And it goes all the way down to the local level. An outlet like Newsmax, which, just went public on the stock market, you can go on their website, and the way they have it set up is they run um, um, syndicated feeds that are hyper local. So you can get your kind of local news about your small town and your news about, um, Donald Trump's, heroic quest to defeat the liberals. And you don't have to leave. That's your whole media diet. Whereas before, I mean, and kind of the bookend is your whole media diet, at the time of the 1968 convention was these three old white men who considered the, main story of American life, uh, us reforming ourselves out of the ordeals of, racism and Vietnam.
So you kind of go and as you kind of mentioned Clinton there for a second, it kind of makes us think of like, okay, so we've been talking a lot about Republicans who have been
Hmm.
part of these like movements against the media, but there are Democratic presidential candidates who've also, I know we discussed like, Bill Clinton and the Telecommunications Act in the 90s had an
Right.
impact.
Right. And that was just that, it's very much in the line of Mark Fowler, the idea that the market is always right, right? Which, obviously, as we've understood, in the case of the founders of the country, would have been a horrifying notion. There wasn't supposed to be a market in journalism. It was basically supposed to be independent of the marketplace. And it's just kind of this wave of deregulation. Um, Clinton allowed even more consolidation and also protected what later became social media platforms from accountability because they were understood to be platforms and not, media editorial. They didn't have a claim not to have an editorial function, or that section 215 or something like that, or
Yeah, I'm
315.
pretty sure that's what Zuckerberg used to say that they're not. Yeah.
Yes, that they're not that, so you can't do anything, right? We're just a town
My
square,
hands are tied. I
Mhm.
just, yeah,
right?
I,
Mhm.
And obviously that's a lie because their algorithms, determine what people see in front of their eyeballs in the same way that editors do. So it's a pretty sad story, but at the same time, you've always had this indomitable will of people to, go into this thankless, non-lucrative,
Mhm.
cutthroat, remorseless business and tell stories about the world and tell the truth and, fight for the underdog. So,
yeah, I was gonna say, I mean, some of
we
us
shall
feel.
overcome.
Yeah, exactly. Some of us feel called to do that regardless of
Exactly. We'll
being
always, it doesn't matter
surrounded.
what kind of boot they'll be stomping down on our face with, we'll always be, just kind of,
Well, I know that you're more of a historian, Rick, and so obviously your lens is going to be looking at the world that has been. But I'm just wondering, though. I mean, living within the world that is now at the
yeah,
same
I'm a
time.
journalist too. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So, do you see the legacy media? I think, Dom,
Hmm.
that's the term that we've settled
Right.
on.
The
Yes.
legacy
Yes.
media. Yeah.
Yes, okay. Um, is still playing catch up to basically the attacks and the accusations made against them from, in some cases, damn near 50, over 50 years ago.
Oh, I mean, very much so. I mean, if you look at,
Solid.
I mean, if you look at, what's happened to the Washington Post under Jeff Bezos, right? I mean, I don't think he could have gotten away with that 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, right? I mean, because there were just these norms. Owners didn't interfere with newspapers that they owned, right? Same with the Los Angeles Times, this crazy owner who wants to slap an AI meter on the top of every article, how
Yeah.
biased it is, as if like AI somehow, is kind of
And plus, it depends on
Zeus on
how
Mount
AI has
Olympus.
been programmed to
Pre-programmed,
determine.
of
Oh
course. There's all
God,
kinds of bias built into AI. We all know
yeah,
that. And the
most of us.
idea that such a like what a dumbass Jeff Bezos is. He says, "Oh, our op-ed page is going to be devoted to um, liberty and free markets." Well, as we pointed out, that's literally the opposite of how the founders of the country understood markets. They saw them as an impediment to liberty when it came to a well-informed public, right? That was the building block of liberty, was basically having all opinions available at all times. And here's this guy Bezos who says, "No, we're only going to have one opinion available on my editorial page."
That's my next historical question is I need to figure out when did having a well-informed public not be the vibe anymore?
Well, I think
Wait
that
a
that
second.
is
Was it when certain demographics were able to participate fully in America?
right. I mean, it's all
There we
backlash, right?
go.
It's all the right wing
Racism.
racism. It comes down to racism. Yeah, right. I mean, if you
Okay.
look at the kind of things, to bring it full circle that Agnew would complain about. He says, "Oh, well, they can make an issue like the supposed epidemic of hunger, a national conversation overnight, right? Which was a really fascinating thing to say, right? It was a way to tell this so-called silent majority that they didn't have to worry about hunger, that what Walter Cronkite was telling them on the evening news, there was a big famous, I think, CBS investigation called Harvest of Shame, and it was about hunger and the plight of farm workers, and the fact that, when you get a journalist and you sit them down in the midst of a world that's full of injustices, they're going to expose the injustices. And instead of that being seen as the vocation of journalism, that's seen as an ideological threat to the almost the emotional security of the people who, you know, have enjoy what W.E.B. Du Bois called the wages of whiteness, that kind of extra bonus they get just for being white in this society. So it's a really kind of
Comfortableness.
comfortableness, right? So a big part of, you know, the MAGA agenda, you know, is all about, there's that great phrase that, the true journalist afflicts the comfortable and comforts the afflicted, right? You never heard that one? Right?
Mm-mm.
So
Hmm,
much of
no.
what, whether it's, what they're doing with history and universities or the criticism they make of the media, it's all about this idea that you should not be afflicted in your comfort. And that's the vocation of journalism, unfortunately. So obviously they have to take on, the very foundations of independent journalism, reporting, information about the world in itself as part of their strategy to, create basically an authoritarian society in which they're in charge.
But Rick, like we've gone through so many years of political attacks against the media. You start to wonder, people right now are at a space where they don't know who to trust in many
Right.
ways.
That's the Putin strategy, right? Or
Yeah.
Steve Bannon when he said, we're gonna flood the zone with shit.
Yeah. So
And
how do you get, but my question is like, you get to a certain point where even for their side, nobody
right,
trusts, like, what I mean? If all the sides don't
right,
trust one another, where does that all go? I mean, I hate to put it this way. I mean, there
right,
you have a lot of liberals who are also in a space. I've seen more and more liberals who, listen, there was a period of time where you saw people who were, if you said conspiracy, talking about conspiracy theories, oftentimes it was, we were looking from the right side of how the left was doing things. Now all of a sudden you see a lot of people on the left talking the same way about the right, and now you get to a point where it's
right.
all sort of jumbled together. And where
It's
does
kind
the
of like
truth?
this weird thing of it's like entropy, right? It's like,
Yeah,
there was this great political figure in America that I'm always quoting. He was the Speaker of the House in the 1950s. He was Lyndon Johnson's mentor. His name was Sam Rayburn, Big Sam. And he said, any jackass can knock down a barn. It takes a carpenter to build one. And, what, kind of creates trust in institutions that are reliable it takes carpenters to build them, right? It's slow. It's sometimes agonizing, right? It involves lots of trade-offs. It's frustrating. And then I know, you can basically, it's like that great Mark Twain quote, like a lie can go halfway around the world in the time it takes the truth to lace up its boots. So it's easier to destroy than it is to build, especially when it becomes to communication and trust. Um, so I mean, I think that, it's just you just got to keep on grinding, right? I mean, you just kind of keep on following you know, best practices of our profession, right? And unfortunately, the next phase of the story will be built out of ruins, right? And those will be creative opportunities. So, we just have to be on hand and ready to build once, that barn has been knocked down.
All right. Well, I mean, I think that's an excellent note for us to leave it on. But we end every interview by asking all of our guests, what drew you to journalism, excuse me.
Mm,
Why did you become a journalist? What made you want to do this thankless job?
the 60s. The 60s, man. When I was a teenager and I got my driver's license, I would go to this used bookstore in Milwaukee and I would go in the basement and I'd read old issues of magazines. And I was just obsessed with like how dramatic the social movements of the 60s were and how it seemed like a new revolution would just kind of pop out every day, month, year, whether it was, music and culture or politics or just kind of ways of people living together. And it was a golden age for journalism because everyone was revisiting the old rules, right? They were starting to tell journalism, in the first person, more opinion, more kind of cultural color, and when I started, kind of really reading journalism, in a kind of deliberate way, the people I gravitated to were the new journalism heroes of the 60s, you know, Tom Wolfe, Joan Didion, James Baldwin, um, Gloria Steinem doesn't get her due. She was an amazing new journalist. And that's the spirit I've always tried to. It's ironic because I write about the 60s, but I write about the present in a very 60s way, trying to really kind of like um, get at that, basic idea of what it means to be radical, get at the root, you know, really just kind of be always kind of questioning the basic structures and forms and you know, tell stories.
Well, Rick, I know we said that was our last question. I lied. But I'm a journalist. What can I say? But no, as I think about everything that you said to us, and I think about especially that last point about whatever comes next is going to be built out of the ruins. One of the themes that I hear coming up again and again, either from people who are going to journalism conferences, or more importantly, maybe not directly, but indirectly from the news consuming public, is
Hmm.
people want authenticity, and that this
Hmm.
notion of our
Well, that was
um
very 60s too. This idea that like
yeah,
the
this
the forms of
unbiased thing.
journalism had become so sterile that they didn't
Yes.
match what they were seeing.
And
So
that
maybe a
people
new
don't
new
like
forms
that.
of journalism, will kind of come out of this movement, and that's exciting.
Do you think that it's possible for a journalist to, while being a full-formed human being, which of course has a point of view based on life experiences, can still be a fair storyteller?
Absolutely. I mean, if that wasn't true, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing, I have a point of view. I am, personally, all the journalism I've done has been activism journalism, activist journalism, and I'm very upfront. I've never, worked for a newspaper. I've never, been in the police shack. I've never had a pretension to objectivity. I always used to joke that, William F. Buckley was my role model,
All right.
But
have a
it's
point of
so,
view.
but we've been all taught, many of us journalists have been taught that you have to be neutral, that there's no bias in your reporting. And I kind of feel like maybe that's where we've all kind of fucked up in this whole thing, is the fact that
It's
we've sort of kept
so
ourselves
interesting.
out of, do you know what I mean? Like so when
Yeah.
you go to
Well,
a lot of journalism
I
school.
mean, it's like the journalists who were forced to write about the 1968 convention in Chicago for their news organizations in Chicago following the old rules were so disgusted by the fact that they couldn't even get at the literal truth because they always had to tell both sides of the story as if they had equal moral worth. These guys, a bunch of my heroes here in Chicago, created a journalism review, the Chicago Journalism Review, in which they really started just kind of interrogating what these norms were. And the journalism got better. Journalism did get better in the 70s, and it retrenched during, I think, the Reagan era. And a lot of that was the hardball that was being played by the institutions of power. So, I think a better journalism is possible.
Well, then that is the
Okay.
note that we should leave it on. Rick, I want to thank you so much for joining us. This has been a fascinating conversation. Although sobering, very, very sobering.
Yeah.
Sobering. I need a drink. It's the opposite of sobering.
Yeah, actually, I might need a drink after all of this because
Yes.
wow, history repeats itself. But thank you for joining us.
Thanks,
Thanks,
guys.
Rick.
Take care. Bye bye. Thanks for doing what
Absolutely.
you
Bye.
do.
So, how does all of this impact our current media ecosystem?
Well, since the introduction of online media, there's been an explosion of right-leaning content online.
Yeah. And actually, Media Matters for America recently published an article about how right-leaning shows have a disproportionate impact in digital media. And I got a chance to talk to the author. After the election, there was a lot of talk among Democrats and people on the left about building a left-wing media ecosystem to counteract the many popular voices and personalities that either identified as far right or had right-leaning ideologies. But is this even a realistic goal or something that's even attainable? I mean, research is already showing that when it comes to alternative or digital media spaces where Americans are increasingly turning to for their news and information, right-leaning content creators have the largest followings. In fact, recently, Media Matters for America, which is a nonprofit left-leaning journalism watchdog organization, released a report showing just how much right-leaning content was being consumed on the most popular streaming platforms on the internet. Kayla Gertie is author of the study titled "The Right Dominates the Online Media Ecosystem, Seeping into Sports, Comedy, and Other Supposedly Non-Political Spaces." So, welcome, Kayla, to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. So first of all, I just want to start that saying that you're a research director at Matters, and you have a background in LGBTQ media and advocacy. So what drew you specifically to this topic?
Yeah, so I started at Media Matters about 6 years ago, and was on our LGBTQ program team, specifically looking at the way that right-wing media pushes misinformation about the LGBTQ community. And I started looking more into online spaces and eventually kind of pivoted more into this space. First, we were looking at social media. Now, obviously, as the media landscape evolves, this has started to get more into the online show, media ecosystem.
And what exactly were you trying to, I guess, assess as to what was going on here? Or were you just looking in general and you didn't have anything specifically that you were trying to determine?
Yeah, so we've been, monitoring the right-wing media ecosystem for decades at Media Matters, and we find that they typically dominate, various spaces, whether it's cable news, whether it's, social media. We wanted to look at the online media ecosystem specifically, and after the election, we know that people were talking about, the role that they might have played in the election, and everybody was kind of talking about, their vibes and things like that. So we wanted to put data and put a number on, this anecdotal vibes that everybody was talking about.
Well, so with all the research that you did, of course, we're going to link to the article, but who's drawing the bigger audience and by, if your assessment, how much?
Yeah, so our findings really underscore the right's disproportionate reach to a wide variety of audiences in the online media ecosystem. I'd say we had two key findings: that across platforms, the right had way more followers and subscribers than the left-leaning shows did. I believe it was 5 times the bigger audience, which was a pretty astonishing number, even that we didn't anticipate. The other key finding that we had was that as we dug deeper into some of these shows, some of them were self-identifying as a comedy show or as, sports related or something like that on like the podcast charts. But when we dug in a little bit further and looked at the content, we were seeing that they were, having more ideological guests on the show or talking about news and politics. So what we found was that across that subset of shows that identified along these other non-political categories, but that we did find they did talk about news and politics, we found that 72% of them were actually right-leaning. So our other key finding there was that the right is more, prominently seeping into these supposedly non-political spaces, entertainment, sports, comedy. And among some of the largest shows that we saw, 9 of the top 10 were right-leaning, and about half of those were shows that claimed to be about comedy or education, not necessarily coming out and outright saying, we're about talking about news, we're talking about politics, or being forthcoming that they're talking about it in a right-leaning, ideological way.
Okay, that's so fascinating because one of the things that I guess a lot of programming from legacy media is often accused of, and I'm guessing probably by people who are on the right or right leaning, is that, oh, everything's so leftist, it's so progressive, it's so democratic and sympathetic this way and the other. But it sounds like that's what is sort of existing, at least in this podcast sphere, this digital media, social media, entertainment ecosystem.
Yeah, we're seeing the right really dominating that online, show media ecosystem. I think one of the findings that we had was that YouTube is where a lot of those audiences are. The followers and subscribers on YouTube was far more than, you might have seen on Spotify or Apple Podcast, which I thought was an interesting finding.
That is incredibly interesting because I was wondering like who's drawing most of this traffic or who's, I guess, the delivery system for most of this traffic.
Yeah, I think one of the things I would just add is we found that, yes, they were putting their full episodes on YouTube, for instance, but they were all, the right is very good at using other social media platforms as well. So they'll clip an episode and then they'll spread those clips across a variety of platforms. So Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and that gets more, views on the content.
Okay. All right. I feel like there's notes to be taken here. Well, one of the other things, and this really broke my heart as a journalist, but the article points out, your piece points out that that the Pew Research had recently released a study that found that not only were podcasts a source of news and information, which again, not hating on that, but 87% of people who were listening to podcasts were hearing news, but only expected it to be, quote, mostly accurate. So it's not as if people are listening to some of these big podcasts and expecting factual information. If it's good enough, it's good enough. That broke my heart. But then adding on to that, 31% of people were saying that they trust those podcasts more than other news sources. So I don't know. Can you unbreak my heart? Like, is there something to be taken away here from what we're learning from public interest and public behavior?
Well, I think when people are tuning into their shows, they're not necessarily going for their news and news and politics related content. They're going to see their favorite comedian, interview another comedian, or go see their celebrity, that they like to follow, in an interview. But then, along with some of these, comedy interviews and different things, you start to see the politics kind of creep in. And I think, these shows have trusted audiences. So when you've been following Joe Rogan for years. And now he's starting to tell you, you're more likely to, take that in and consume that and believe it.
Okay. All right. So you sort of mentioned the impact that this all had politically. And I know that all of this, I guess, sort of came together in what people referred to as the podcast election from 2024. When it came to, I guess, platforms, especially these podcast platforms, what was the reach like for, well, let's face it, Senator Vice President Kamala Harris, or former president, now president again, Donald Trump? How many people are we talking about reaching just through podcasts?
Yeah, so this isn't our own data, but another firm or outlet, they had found that millions more people were getting their eyes on these interviews with Trump. He went on to a variety of supposedly non-political shows and got interviewed on these podcasts. Kamala Harris similarly went on a show or two, but based on some of the numbers that we've seen from other people, that the reach was not anywhere near what Trump had.
Are some of these podcast shows outreaching, say, legacy news media shows? Because I remember that being a sticking point, was that, the Harris campaign isn't sitting down with Meet the Press and all this other stuff. And I'm wondering if that's also just a numbers thing where, the numbers are there in this digital space now.
Yeah, I think the right is doing really well in this space because they're meeting the audiences where they are, and they've always been good at evolving. When we first saw that people were getting their news from Facebook more so, for instance, the right was really good at pushing out content there and really exploiting the algorithms to get that content to people. Because, the algorithms often are going to prioritize, outrage, fear-mongering, other evocative content as opposed to dry facts and statistics. And then, we're seeing that play out with these online shows as well. The YouTube algorithms, TikTok algorithms, that sort of content that's going to, evoke emotions is going to play well. And the right has been very good at evolving and going to these media spaces where people are and trying to use these algorithms to get their messaging out.
So is this a case where, if we're comparing the two, that there's just more content to be had from right-wing or right-leaning content creators? Or is it a case where audiences are more interested in this content and that's what's driving the numbers? Like, I guess I'm sort of stuck as to what's the chicken, what's the egg here.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of both, but there is way more content being pushed out by the right across these platforms. So they're able to get into these variety of spaces. As I previously said, people aren't necessarily going out to look for politics, but as it's seeping into some of your favorite shows or these non-political spaces, you're inherently hearing it. And I think that's part of where the success has been.
So is there, because one of the other things that I found so interesting was the reference to, I guess, non-political content. And one of the things that we've been discussing on Laid Off and Looking is that is there such thing as non-bias, period? I mean, doesn't everything sort of have a lean to it? And it's more a case of how you are interpreting whatever the information is, or is there a actual clear, I don't know, like dog whistles or something that's taking place? For full clarification, I haven't listened to a lot of these podcasts referenced, but that's influencing people and perhaps helping them draw certain conclusions based on the way topics are talked about or joked about, etc.
Yeah, I think if there's a ton of content and you're hearing this narrative over and over, you're more likely to believe it, especially in these places from trusted people that you trust. One interesting, kind of tidbit that we had found was that in some of these non-political spaces, you might see your favorite celebrity or you might see your favorite, comedian. And so you're watching and then you'll hear like a little bit, in the first 30 days of Trump's administration, you might hear a little praise about Trump or some of his policies. And it's not the entirety of the content of the show. It's just, here and there. And so I think, as you're not going out to listen to, the news, you might be overwhelmed. You don't want to hear it, but you're going to hear, your favorite celebrity. And then you're starting to hear some of this. And there's just a great abundance. And then, you might be scrolling on TikTok and you see a clip of one of these shows, and that might lead you to then go to these shows. We're also seeing the right kind of seep into these spaces, in twofold. The first way is kind of, these non-political spaces that have started to get more political. But we've also seen right-wing figures like Candace Owens or Megyn Kelly, for instance, really starting to get into some of these more non-political spaces. So talking about celebrities, talking about, culture and things like that. And so we're seeing it kind of seep in that sense as well. So you might come across Candace's, TikTok video, and then you might start looking at some of her other content.
Uh-huh. Okay. So here's one of the other things that I'm noticing, especially when it comes to the online content, where however it is that people are getting or absorbing news and information. It seems to be less about the accuracy of the information and also less about the quote unquote fair and balancedness and more about hearing from someone you feel as though you know. Like it's more personality driven. And then whatever the personality bend is, that's how people are more interested in getting their information. And that's, podcast hosts, news influencers. They want to feel like they know the person. And then that makes absorbing the information that whatever it is that person is selling or saying a lot easier to digest.
Yeah, and people want authentic content. They like that storytelling. And, as I said, yes, people want that too, but the algorithms are also more likely to push that sort of content as well.
Wow. Okay. That's that. I mean, so much of this now is going against what I learned and was trained as a journalist, but clearly pivoting. We're in a pivot zone right now. The last thing I also want to bring up is that when I was going through a lot of the shows that your piece pointed out, with the exception of Megyn Kelly, Candace Owens, I'm noticing that most of these content creators are heavily male, and on top of that, heavily either white or white presenting. Is there a takeaway to be had from that?
Yeah, I did notice that as well. A lot of the hosts of these large shows, they are men. As you saw from our chart and some of those top shows there. I think that's part of why we've gotten the narrative that, young men might have, swayed more towards Trump, hearing this right-leaning content. But I think, there are women out there, and I think it's we'll see how that is the next space that plays out. We'll see how that plays out as, some progressives and some right-leaning influencers try and go into that space a little bit more as well.
That is super fascinating. That was the one last thing that I was just like, wait, there's a clear pattern here.
Yeah.
All right. Well, listen, Kayla, thank you. First of all, thank you so much for doing this research and like laying out, especially like in visual means, how you can clearly see, because in one of your graphs, one of them that caught my attention was the only larger blue bubble of a left-leaning show was Trevor Noah. And then everything else were these tiny little dots and everything else was these huge red bubbles.
Yeah.
I think seeing it lays out what the state of play is a lot
Yeah,
better.
I think that that's really resonated with people because, as I said, people had those vibes, they kind of knew it, but we wanted to put the data to some of those vibes and really, get out that the right really is dominating these spaces.
Well, yeah, I mean, you can't go wrong with data. Kayla, thank you so much for taking a few minutes to talk with me. I really appreciate this.
Thank you so much for having me. Nice to meet you.
Absolutely. Laid Off and Looking is an independent podcast conceived of and created by Jenna Flanagan and Dominic Camia.
Music provided by Jake Howitt. Research by Laura Rothenbucker.
You can watch and follow us on YouTube.
Or you can listen and follow us wherever you get your podcasts.
And if you have any questions or suggestions, we want to hear from you. So leave a comment.
We do check them.
Or reach out to us anytime at laidofandlookingpod@gmail.com.
New episodes every Friday.